Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar. I am Amanda Perez at the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. And today I am so happy to present Carolyn Lemsky, who is the Clinical Director at Community Head Injury Resource Services of Toronto and a Director of the Substance Use and Brain Injury Bridging Project. I would also like to mention that funding for this was provided by the Administration for Community Living and co-sponsored by ACL Underserved Populations and Opioid Use and Mental Health Needs Work Groups. So that being said, Carolyn, again, thank you so much for doing this today. I'm going to hand this off to you.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. Hi, I'm Carolyn Lemsky. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by training, but I've been spending the past 10 or 15 years thinking a lot about the support of people who have comorbid brain injury, mental health, and addictions problems in the community. And I guess that's what we're going to be talking about today. I have no relevant disclosures to make, and you've already heard the acknowledgments for funding for this presentation. So I'm just going to jump back in with a little bit of a summary of the first webinar in this series, and that was presented by my esteemed colleague and friend, John Corrigan of the Ohio Valley Center for Brain Injury Prevention and Rehabilitation. And you can watch the full webinar of that on the CBERT website, and you can see the link there for that presentation. And so I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes or so just going over some of the highlights of that before we jump into the new content so that everybody's on the same page. So Dr. Corrigan started out by telling us about what TBI is, that it is a blow to the head that is also affecting the brain, not just the head, and that the severity of a brain injury is usually associated with the degree of change in a person's consciousness or the loss of consciousness. And so brain injuries come in all severities, from mild to severe, and a mild injury would be considered from no loss of consciousness to about 30 minutes of loss of consciousness, or maybe even 24 hours of conscious but change in memory or some confusion. And then moderate brain injury is a loss of consciousness of 30 minutes to up to 24 hours. And then a severe brain injury would be a loss of consciousness of more than 24 hours. And he pointed out to us that within those categories, there is a ton of variation, and that a single mild traumatic brain injury may not have lasting effects. It's when we have multiple mild injuries or when there's a pre-existing condition that there's a higher risk for lasting effects of a brain injury. And he also discussed the fact that TBIs at a young age, even apparently mild ones, can have consequences in adulthood and may result in an increased risk for addictions and mental health problems. And we know that at-risk populations are substance users because of the kinds of stuff that happens when a person's intoxicated, including falls, and also a risk from overdoses in the form of an anoxic injury. Active members of the military, domestic abuse survivors, athletes that participate in contact sports. And then we also know that people who've had one TBI are actually at risk for more than one TBI. And he also talked about, and we're going to touch on this in this webinar, the fingerprints of TBI, the predictable patterns that occur. And they include the frontal and temporal lobes being more vulnerable, and all of those structures that are really responsible for managing emotional and behavioral regulation. So I'm just going to this is a very quick and dirty summary of some of the epidemiological data that he presented, just to kind of reinforce the fact that TBI may be affecting a lot of the folks that you serve in mental health and addiction settings. So these data, and again, this is a summary of a number of studies, really reflect the lifetime history of TBI of all different severities with loss of consciousness among the clients you serve. And he reviewed data that told us that, less than 1 in 5 or right around 1 in 5 of non-institutionalized adults will have a lifetime history of brain injury that includes a loss of consciousness. But that's double to triple in people who are seeking substance use treatments and who are psychiatric inpatients. And wow, it's like 3 or 4 out of 5 in people who are seeking treatment for co-occurring disorders, so substance use and a mental health issue. And if we look at just the moderate to severe group, so only those people who've had a substantial loss of consciousness, it makes up between 3 and 6% of non-institutionalized adults over the course of their lifetime. But a whopping 15 to 20% of people seeking treatment for substance use disorders or psychiatric inpatients. And in the data he reviewed, 15 to 20% of people are homeless. And I've been involved with a few projects related to homelessness, and I can tell you that the number is more like 75% when we look at that group of people who are homeless or unstably housed, who have had that problem over a long period of time and have multiple comorbidities. So it's really a big hunk of the folks we serve. And the clinical observations that are frequently made of this group of people who have a history of brain injury, particularly those with loss of consciousness or multiple mild injuries, is that they have an even bigger gap between what they intend to do and what they're actually able to follow through with. And now all of us, when we're making a health-related behavior change, have some gap between what we intend and what we actually manage to accomplish. But for our clients who have brain injury, it really is a much larger gap, and we have to be considering the fact that they may need external supports to actually meet their goals. And our clients who have acquired brain injury or neurocognitive or neurobehavioral impairments often have more difficulty finding and engaging in services, and they may leave services early, and often because they're viewed as somebody who is non-compliant or unmotivated to take part in treatment. So he laid out 5 recommendations for all service providers, and we're going to pursue some of them today and in the 3rd webinar in our series. And one of them is routine screening for brain injury and other sources of neurocognitive impairment. And at the end of this webinar, I'll tell you how you can get more training for screening. Learning to recognize when behaviors are the result of neurological changes. And we're going to address a little bit of that in today's webinar with respect to mental health problems. And how to make programs more accommodating. And what we have time for in this webinar series is to kind of do an overview of that, but we will be mentioning how you can get more specific recommendations and really think about how to bring these recommendations into your practice. A 4th really important idea that Dr. Carolyn brought forward and that I certainly endorse is that we have to begin to review complexity as the rule in our clients rather than the exception. And we have to start developing programs that accommodate that complexity. And again, care plans that include long-term supports, and that may be informal supports. So being more ready to involve family members and friends and other members of the community and other agencies perhaps, and also formal supports in the form of case management or supported housing. So the overview of what I'm going to try and do over the next, say, 40 minutes or so is give some examples of how and why mental health problems and TBI interact, how they're alike, and how they can make each other worse. And then we're going to talk a bit about accommodating neurobehavioural impairments and also accommodating cognitive impairments. And we'll look at a few universal accommodations and some programming considerations. And again, at the end, I'll be talking about resources that you can use to go find out more about these topics. So going back to what Dr. Corrigan was talking about the fingerprint of TBI, this is the inside of a skull, and there's all those bony ridges. And when when a brain gets bounced around in the skull, it leads to a very predictable pattern of injury, at least to the surface of the brain. And you can see that it differentially affects those frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. And what underlies those structures is all of the stuff that helps us to take advantage of information of the environment in terms of rewards and punishments so that we can focus our behavior appropriately activity. And you might recognize this diagram as being one that's used often in the explanations that are related to the development of addictive disorders. But there's also another element to injury that I think is important to mention, and that is axonal shearing. And that's when the brain gets twisted in the cranial vault and the actual nerve fibers can get twisted apart. Now, the MRI that's showing in this illustration is a more severe injury, and when the injury is more severe, you can sometimes see little areas of bleeding, and usually these occur at the junction of the white and gray matter, which is, where the cerebral cortex is joins the connective tissues underneath, and I'll try and make that clear in a minute. Now, in mild traumatic brain injuries, there may be some axonal shearing that occurs, but it's so mild you don't even see it on the imaging. But the idea here is that the functional connections or the structural connections among brain structures may be impacted to a greater or lesser degree after brain injury. So when we talk about the structural disconnections, there's a functional disconnection that also occurs. And this is a really cool new kind of image that I'm showing here. It's diffuser tensor imaging, and it's actually a way of almost watching the brain think by looking at the way water molecules move up and down these axons. So the axons that are there, they might be structurally intact, but are they functioning the way that they should be? And that's what these images show. Now, this is a comparison between a rather severe injuries, just to make it more dramatic. And what you can see on the control is that there's kind of organized tracts there, and you can see where the arrow points to all those lovely red fibers that are in the middle of the brain. That's the corpus callosum, which connects, it's a set of fibers that connects the right and the left sides of the brain, so there's good connectivity there. And look at what happens in a severe traumatic brain injury. Those connections, those functional connections, are disrupted, both across the brain, and if you look, there's those little almost butterfly-looking images on the bottom of those MRIs, and you can see that that's the top-to-bottom connectivity. And so the structures deep in the brain, towards the top of the brain stem and the rest of the cortex, are also disrupted, so it's side to side and up and down. Now, in a mild traumatic brain injury, these things are present. There's research to show us that there is disrupted connectivity even in mild brain injury. It may be temporary if there isn't another pre-existing condition to make it lasting, or if there aren't multiple mild brain injuries so that a person isn't healing properly. But these same patterns, to a lesser extent, occur also in mild traumatic brain injury. Now, why it's important to have really good connectivity all throughout the brain has a lot to do with the way the brain divides the work that it does. Now, this is a very simplified diagram, and it's based on how the brain evolved. But it's a good way of thinking about this when we're thinking about the impact of acquired brain injury on mental health issues. So on the very inside of the brain, you have the oldest structures, the first to evolve. We call it the reptilian brain, or it's been called the reptilian brain. And it's responsible for all these instinctual behaviors, also autonomic functions like breathing and heart rate. And so that was all the brain functioning that a lower reptile might need. But as mammals evolved, they needed to use emotions to sort of guide their behavior in the environment, to sort of move towards things that were good for them and away from things that weren't working out so well. And included in that limbic system is actually a memory system. And it's no mistake that the memory system evolved with the emotional system, because there was definite advantage in terms of survival to remember the things that were both good for you and perhaps frightening. And then the last structures to evolve are the neocortex or the new cortex, and that's where all the conscious brain activity is happening. Now, we're only aware of what we're aware of. We're only aware of conscious brain activity. But that really only constitutes about 20% of what your brain is doing. There's a ton of processing that's occurring in these other two brain units, in the limbic system and in the lower aspects of the brainstem, that are helping to keep you alive and functioning. And you know that a lot of automatic functioning is occurring. If you've ever had the experience, just in terms of a lower reflex of touching something hot, and you've touched the stove and it's in your mouth before you even realize it was hot and it hurt. Or if you've had the even more frightening phenomenon of driving home on a busy road, thinking about something that maybe happened at work, and you can't even remember the drive home, and yet you stopped at every stop sign and you obeyed all the traffic laws, and you probably would, hopefully, if you weren't distracted too much, see something run across the road and respond properly. And the way that you can do that is because your brain has a lot of automatic processing going on below the level of consciousness. So the gap between what a person says and what they do after brain injury is really a matter of poor connectivity. And having a mental disorder is a risk factor for poor recovery and long-term outcomes after traumatic brain injuries of all severities. So we're going to take a quick look at, and because of time, we're just going to look at depression and PTSD. And I gather that there were a lot of questions after the first webinar about PTSD, which is why I've chosen to talk a little bit more about that. But depression actually makes the good general case. So this is a complicated slide, and I'll walk you through it. The top left up here talks about the structural neural disconnection, and that's what happens as the result of the injury with all of that axonal shearing that can occur. And what that translates into is that the brain has more trouble connecting with itself in an organized and structured way. And we call these large-scale functional networks. So there's a predictable pattern that our brain uses to, for example, be at rest, which is the default network, and then to approach different kinds of tasks that require different kinds of focus. So in a typically functioning brain, the brain in a coordinated fashion recruits these areas of the brain and uses those strong connections to do its work. And you can see in a normal brain, the frontal lobe is involved in the default network, that's the brain at rest, and you can see that there's a weaker signal coming from the frontal lobe after traumatic brain injury. And now I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the diagram that you have there on the right of your screen. But that was published in a review article about a lot of functional imaging data that relates to depression. And now we're talking about depression with no brain injury. If you look at depressed brains and how they work, there are differences in how they recruit large-scale functional networks. So you have and if you work with people who are depressed, this kind of makes sense. I mean, we know that there are cognitive biases that occur in a person who's depressed. They may be more responsive to their affective state and particular kinds of emotional states, and they may think things through in a more rigid or limited way with a bias towards negative information. And in fact, what the data show when you watch depressed people think in using fancy EEGs that are three-dimensional and functional MRI and regular EEGs, that there's an imbalance in the way that the frontal lobe is interacting with the limbic structures. So it really kind of makes sense that when you add a structural disconnection to that functional disconnection, that each would make the other worse, that they would have a synergy that might predict a poor outcome for both the neurocognitive and the neurobehavioral aspects of the depression. And so even in mild traumatic brain injury, we find that if a person has a history of, for example, depressed mood, that they may be at risk for a longer length of time to take to recover from those post-concussive symptoms that include things like headache and dizziness, and also depressed mood, irritability, and emotional ability. Now, to make things a little more complicated, you can have certain symptoms of depressed mood that are directly related to damage to specific brain structures. So we won't get into too much detail, but for example, apathy, which can range from just, trouble getting started on any given day to needing somebody present to prompt every single behavior, can result from damage to specific parts of the frontal lobe, in this case, the cingulate. And blunted affect can also be, and labile affect can also be the direct result of damage to the supraorbital cortex, or the part of the frontal lobes that rests right above the eyes. Changes in appetite and sleep disturbance can be altered directly by changes in brainstem or autonomic functioning. Fatigue occurs when a person has to use more conscious functioning to influence their automated functioning, and as a result of disconnection. And that also happens in depressed mood. And on the flip side, it's possible to be depressed and have cognitive symptoms that result from the depression itself. So people who are depressed, when you examine them and using neuropsych testing, they have poorer memory, they have poor problem solving and attention and concentration difficulties. And they tend to have a particular pattern, and they tend to be a little bit milder. But very often, you can't really tell, especially when the brain injury has been mild, what cognitive issues are related to the depressed mood and what are related to the longer term effects of the traumatic brain injury. Chicken and the egg. So moving along to the more complex, in some sense, situation with PTSD, we can talk about PTSD really being the result of a neurobiological process that results in an error of processing a memory out of context or without enough contextual cues. So now this comes from a really nice review article from some folks over at University of Michigan. And what they were talking about is the fact that our brains were evolved to be as efficient as possible in processing information, particularly related to threats. So a lot of automatic processing occurs when there is a threat present, because thinking it through would be both more energy intensive and less efficient. So what happens when we're processing a memory, particularly a traumatic memory, is that the emotional system kicks in, the frontal lobe turns off, and the body goes through a number of neurochemical and neurobiological changes that lead to the release of catecholamines and other neurotransmitters that make memory writing especially vivid at the time of the trauma. And all of that occurs without much participation from the executive portions of the brain. Now, that had a survival advantage back when the brain was evolving, particularly at the stage of mammals who were predated or lived in dangerous environments, in the sense that you would really want the owner of the brain who had been exposed to the frightening thing, the bear or the poisonous snake, whatever it was, to not only be appropriately affected by that memory, but to have periodic reminders, hey, there's a threat present, you got to be aware of this, you got to be on your guard. And having a lot of false positives for a threat had a survival advantage, because the threats that the brain was actually, or the owner of the brain was facing as it evolved, were lethal. So it made sense to flinch at every stick that might be a poisonous snake, because if you didn't flinch, it was fatal. So our brains are actually tipped in the direction of developing anxieties and developing post-traumatic stress syndrome. And when we study the brains of people who have significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress, we notice that functionally they do operate differently. In states where they are in hyperarousal or re-experiencing, their frontal lobe tends to be less active and their emotional system is more active. And in states where they are hypoaroused, that would lead to like depersonalization or derealization, emotional numbing. In those situations, the frontal lobe is hyperactive. It's very, very active relative to a relatively underactive limbic system or emotional system. And now again, you notice that the fingerprint of TBI overlays those structures. So particularly in mild TBI, in very much the same way as with depression, some of the symptoms of the actual injury can mimic those symptoms. But it's a little bit more complicated because it turns out that there's common symptoms between PTSD alone and mild TBI alone. And they include cognitive symptoms like poor concentration, but they also include behavioral symptoms like irritability and anger, sleep disturbance, and fatigue. And in particular with PTSD, impairments of executive functioning. So you notice a rigidity in the way that people problem solve, even if the only issue is just PTSD. So if you really have an interest in this topic, there's a nice white paper that provides a really good summary of the research in this area, and it's put out by the National Center for PTSD. It's available online, and you can get it by Googling PTSD and TBI. And what it points out is that there's a lot of research that shows us that, in fact, there really are a lot of significant brain changes that occur when a person has sustained post-traumatic stress and trauma that results in post-traumatic stress symptoms. It's a neurobiological lesion, but they do find when they look at their brains that there are specific areas of white matter lesions that occur, and they tend to be those that connect a particular part of the emotional system to a particular part of the frontal lobe. And they also tend to have more gray matter lesions. And the hippocampus, which is a structure that's very important in writing memories, can also show a reduction in volume. And we know that mild traumatic brain injury is a risk factor for developing PTSD. But the pattern of, if it's mild traumatic brain injury, the pattern of damage is a little bit different. You know, axonal shearing is a little bit more widely spread and is at that white-gray junction as I discussed. And it's only really in severe brain injuries that you get the hippocampal shrinking. And it doesn't occur in mild TBI. So there are similarities and differences, but the important thing to realize is that both change the brain and both change the brain in particular ways. And the research shows, and this is particularly true for mild TBI and PTSD, and most of this research has been done by amazing groups in the VA and the Department of Defense, because it's, of course, of a particular interest to that group. Most of the research would suggest that the same kinds of interventions that work for PTSD and traumatic brain injury together would work for either on their own. So the lessons for treatment that they draw from that literature are that cognitive processing and exposure-based treatments work equally well with and without TBI. But you have to realize that most of that research has been done with mild TBI. And a modified treatment that includes treatment for problems with working memory, verbal memory, and problem solving had increased benefits for both groups, but primarily for the group that also had mild traumatic brain injury. But in most cases, particularly with mild traumatic brain injury, it really doesn't matter which of these is actually causing a particular symptom. The treatment is largely going to be the same. It's a little different for moderate to severe brain injury, and there's a little bit of controversy about whether or not you can actually have PTSD if you can't remember the event. In my clinical experience, yes, people do have, they develop anxiety that has very much the pattern of PTSD. And in the case of moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, you have to kind of think about which symptoms of the PTSD may be brain injury related directly and mimicking the PTSD. Now, just briefly, other symptoms that are often associated with the wide range of mental health disorders that there are include anger and irritability, and particularly in psychiatric populations, when there's particular problems with anger and irritability, there's a high likelihood of traumatic brain injury, and that is most particularly true when it's not just irritability, but it's an episodic sort of rage attacks tend to be much more closely associated with acquired brain injury, and require a different approach to treatment. Now, Dr. Corrigan talked a little bit about how TBI really is a risk factor, unfortunately, for suicidality, both attempts and completed suicides. And the risk is somewhere between 20 and 30% higher in people with a history of traumatic brain injury of all ages. And the additional risk factors that come with that are co-occurring substance use disorders, PTSD symptoms, depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric symptoms, and impulsivity and emotional dysregulation. Now, I thought that I would sort of introduce this idea as well, that it's been the observation of a number of authors who look at the epidemiology of these things, but it's also been kind of a clinical observation that I've made, that folks who have a history of acquired brain injury of all severities are much more likely to have a diagnosis of personality disorder, even sometimes where that didn't exist prior to the brain injury. And my interpretation of the reason for that is that some of the executive functioning problems and difficulties with reading and managing emotion look like the kinds of egocentricity and problems with empathy and problems with emotional regulation that are very common in people who are diagnosed with different types of personality disorders, particularly borderline personality. Now, as Dr. Corrigan talked about in the first webinar, brain injury definitely, particularly early in life, has increases the risk for developing a psychotic disorder later in life, but it's actually one of the less common outcomes of moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. But there is something to be aware of, that very often people who have neurocognitive impairment, particularly after perhaps multiple brain injuries with loss of consciousness or moderate to severe injuries. And so people who are living with poor memory often develop what seems like a paranoid kind of flavor to them. It might be something as simple as feeling that people are taking their belongings because they keep mislaying things, or believing that people are stealing their money because they can't remember having spent it. But it can also relate to how they put two and two together when they're trying to remember events in the past, and maybe making misattributions related to other people's motives. And so in this case, very often what clinicians notice, and I certainly do, is that it's those kinds of psychotic-like or delusional-like symptoms in a person who has an acquired brain injury, if that is the primary reason, are actually more responsive to a cognitive behavioral approach than folks who might have a diagnosis of a schizophrenia or a schizotypal personality. So when they're more responsive, it's a suggestion that that might be associated with TBI, because they'll allow you to walk them through and to develop, walk them through reasoning and to develop memory compensation strategies that actually help them to feel better and feel less paranoid. So in summary of this section, functional connectivity, or large brain circuits functioning together, enable healthy brain functioning. And both brain injury and mental health disorders can alter how the brain communicates, and therefore how much influence that conscious part of the brain has on all of that automatic processing. Many symptoms of mental health disorders overlap with symptoms of brain injury. And often the source of a particular problem will be impossible to determine. We often don't know whether it's depressed mood or PTSD or mild traumatic brain injury that's causing a particular situation. But the good news is, particularly with mild traumatic brain injury, it doesn't matter. Accommodating the cognitive impairments and using the same treatments is generally effective. So we're going to move now a little bit into our second portion of the talk, which is thinking about accommodating cognitive and neurobehavioral impairments. And we're going to get a chance to do this in broad strokes, get a couple of examples of the way these things play out in practice, and then point you to some more resources to think more about it. So the bottom line is that when a client is having trouble engaging in or benefiting from your intervention, you have to ask yourself two questions. Could this be related to a neurological problem? And what can I do to accommodate? Now, what that generally means is that if a person's having trouble getting to your appointments or not following through, rather than making the attribution that this is something that's being done intentionally, it probably makes more sense to behave as if that they're doing the best they can and helping them to develop some strategies that will help them to follow through. And if you keep experiencing roadblocks, you can deal with those. But assuming that it is a cognitive impairment gives you a healthy place to move forward and a healthy way to begin your intervention. So when we think about accommodating cognitive impairment, there's a couple of principles that you really want to kind of keep firmly in your head. And one of them is that no two brain injuries are alike. And the other thing is, and I should have put it perhaps on this slide, is that some of the brain behavior relationships are not intuitively obvious. So it often isn't correct to say, well, if a person can remember this, why can't they remember that? And I'll give you one example. It's possible for a person who can't remember episodes that occur 2 or 3 minutes apart to learn a procedure. So they can learn a routine through repetition because that's kind of another memory system, even if they don't even remember the fact that they've been trained. So many clients of mine who have a lot of difficulty remembering episodes may have a clear idea of what to do in certain circumstances or certain patterns of behavior that keep repeating themselves. So it may be true that they know how to get on a bus and come to you, even if they can't remember their appointment. Or they may know very clearly how to, say, seek out substances, even if they can't remember some of the things that you speak about. So we really have to think about the fact that it isn't only the injury itself, but we do have to know about that. It's the person who has been injured. And how these things play out have a lot to do with that person's mental health and addictions history, but also the patterns that they had in their life and their psychosocial circumstance. So you really have to go to it with a beginner's open mind about what might be causing a given problem. Now, changing the way that services are delivered can reduce the impact of cognitive impairment. And we can do that by reducing cognitive load, as well as encouraging cognitive compensation. So in order to do that, it helps to have kind of a little bit of a model in your head of how does cognition work. And the model that I'm showing here on the slide is kind of a simplification of a model that's used in the development of cognitive rehabilitation. And the idea is that each of these cognitive functions builds one on the next, so that the bottom function, alertness, is necessary for everything that comes after it. So you have to be alert before you can actually pay attention. And you have to be able to pay attention and focus before you can actually get information and process it. And you have to process that information and organize it in some way before you can actually remember it. You put it in a filing cabinet so you can take it back out again. You have to process it a bit. And you have to be able to have some memory of what's happening around you in order to really use executive functioning, which includes functions like planning, mental control, switching between activities, emotional control, self-awareness, and also all aspects of behavioral self-management. So another concept that I kind of wanted to impart is that in your situation, working with people who have brain injury, you're going to want to think about not curing a cognitive problem, but making up for it or helping with it. And you're going to want to help with it in a way that actually moves their activities forward or your intervention forward. So your interventions will be related to very straightforward things like helping a client to show up to your office, doing what you can do to help them pay attention, to remember what to do, to make decisions, to plan, and very importantly, because of the gap between say and do, to help them get started or to initiate those things that they actually determine that they want to do while they're working with you. And the final thing, and often this is neglected, is helping them to evaluate their own performance, to reflect on what's happened and to use that information to plan ahead, because that's very important in helping a person to gain an awareness. Dr. Corrigan talked about cognitive load, or referenced it, and I'm not going to go into great detail. This is a theory that was developed in the context of education. But the general idea here is that we only have so much attention. We only have so much bandwidth that we can use. And any learning activity has three sources of cognitive load, things that drain away that bandwidth. And one is the germane content. And that is, how much does this information match the stuff I already know? And how can I organize it into schemas or ideas so that I can store it in a way that's organized so that when I need it, I can get it back out of the filing cabinet? So that germane processing is how familiar is it, and does that information match, or is it a mismatch from what I already know? Do I have to unlearn something? Intrinsic cognitive load is just the difficulty of the material itself. So if you were teaching arithmetic, it would be just that function and how difficult that is. And then there's all the extraneous stuff. It's all of the distractions that might occur otherwise in the environment. And I go to the trouble of explaining these things because some of the things that we do to decrease cognitive load, and these are generally categories of things that you can do, rely on an understanding of those three kinds of things that can make learning harder. So the first thing is generally slow down. And here we might be talking about slowing down the presentation of material, but it also might be slowing down the actual program of care. It might be allowing a person more time to take advantage of what you're offering to in terms of length of stay. Now, I talk about slowing down to the staff and the folks that I supervise by saying, if you're talking at a rate that feels comfortable for you and you know that your client is having a hard time processing information, you're probably speaking too fast. We tend to speak in paragraphs, and most of the time, we should be speaking in sentences. And another rule of thumb is, if it doesn't feel a little awkward and a little slow, it's probably too fast for clients who are having that kind of issue. Breaking down tasks, and we can think about breaking down tasks with what you have right in front of you, but we can also think about breaking down tasks in terms of a program of care. I know that in our programming, when we have folks come into our addictions program, we spend a period of time just helping people learn who the other people are in the program and learning routines. So there's a breaking in period before we actually dive in and get into the content. And the feedback that our clients have given us is very often when they go to treatment programs, they have a hard time remembering who's who and where they're supposed to be and what's what. And so that by the time they get in the room with the thing that they need to do, it's just been overwhelming. So breaking down tasks in terms of the program itself and in terms of your interactions. And the same goes for using routines. And I think routines are really often a part of cognitive behavior therapies in the sense that we might make safety plans or in relapse prevention, kind of rote responses for triggers or planning ahead for triggers. And using those kinds of routines really is elevated in importance for our clients. When we help them by helping them to remember something like making a note, we also have to remember that we have to teach them how to use that reminder. So it's not enough just to make the note. You have to make the note in such a way that the person's going to remember to reference the note. And very often, putting reminders and matching them up with things that the client's already doing so that their regular activities cue them to use the reminder is kind of a trick. And we'll talk a little bit more about examples of that probably in the next webinar. But creating reminders and teaching clients to use them is very important. Now, the whole thing about that germane load, where you're trying to help a person organize information so they can process it and then they can remember it more easily, really comes forward in setting clear goals and agendas. And again, that can happen on an individual and a programmatic level. One of the things that I hope to demonstrate in the last webinar is how you can use just a piece of paper sitting between you and the client to help remind them of what the purpose of a session is, and then help them to agenda set with you. And using a routine to do that will help the client participate a little better, settle in and focus a little better when you're working with them. And then removing distractions. And again, this applies to just clearing your desk in your office, but it also applies to reducing the extraneous aspects of programs. Very often we want our clients to attend 5 different groups in a day, and I think sometimes we have to really stop and think about what the most germane information is, and making sure that we're reducing the cognitive load so that that information can get in by reducing the expectations in a program. So in general terms, when we're talking about accommodating neurobehavioural impairments, we're talking about sometimes changing the nature of the services that are offered. And that may be, as I've already alluded to, emphasizing behavioral rehearsal and routines, and emphasizing that over even over emotional support and psychotherapy, and something that's insight oriented or even motivationally oriented. Using case management strategies with clients and having those services available. Longer periods of treatment. And I know in our jurisdiction it's in really short supply, and I know that probably around the US that this is the case as well, but where it's available, supported housing is a really good resource, and certainly something that we would lobby for as necessary for that group of people who are experiencing complex comorbidities. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the final webinar, but the use of incentives, and this is particularly true just to get a client to develop the routines to get to your office. If you're offering a coffee card, they develop the routines to get to the office, and then they have those routines, and then they can use those routines in the service of other activities. And what we find is that oftentimes the clients don't attribute their participation to getting a reinforcement, because once they've attended a number of times, they like you, they feel they're benefiting from the program, and that's why they return. So I put in this slide just to kind of think, to be thinking about when you're thinking about case management for folks, and you're thinking about creating a program of care for people who are really complicated and having a hard time with their lives, that there really are 2 very important ways that all of us are successful. And problem solving and good judgment is certainly really important to adaptation, but so are daily routines and habits. And many of our clients' lives are chaotic enough that those simple things that they have to get accomplished, and this is particularly true if somebody's homeless, right? They have to arrange a new way to accomplish to meet their daily needs every day. And so they're spending a lot of time problem solving through that, so that by the time they're trying to deal with other issues, they're exhausted. So helping a client develop a good baseline by meeting those daily needs using good habits and routines is really important. But that also applies to even using routines and habits as a compensation strategy for when a client's judgment isn't very good. And a very simple example of that is something that maybe a lot of us do. I don't carry a lot of cash in my pocket because I might get in the habit of just reaching and spending a lot of that cash. And I only have one credit card so that I know exactly what I'm spending. So I have this routine that helps me to keep within good bounds. And for a lot of our clients, those kinds of like little behavioral supports are really important in helping them to develop the kinds of habits they need to accomplish what they need to, so that they're more open and available to the treatment that they require. Now, we have to be really well aware that a lot of our therapies have the goal of harnessing a person's executive ability so that they can manage all of that autonomic functioning or automatic functioning that's happening, those automatic thoughts and those behavioral patterns that occur or are initiated without a lot of conscious thought. And I think that it's worthwhile to be pursuing those goals. But sometimes we have to change the focus of that to accepting the external supports that a person needs to actually accomplish their goals. And this is a schematic, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the third webinar, but this is a schematic of what's happening in motivational interviewing. And it was originally just based on theory, but now these 9 years later, there actually is a lot of data to support this model. And, while you're in session, you're really using a lot of different parts of your brain, the emotional parts of your brain. You're thinking through incentive and reward by reviewing past situations in which things worked or didn't work and developing motivation. And once you start to get a lot of change talk, that's coming from the incentive part of your brain. But ultimately, you really have to have that executive portion of your brain controlling your behavior and making you follow through. So when a person has a brain injury, they're at a big disadvantage of that. And there's evidence in the literature to suggest that in the absence of those functional supports in the environment, things just don't work out as well. So longer term options such as sober homes, where a client has maybe a year or two to develop new patterns of behavior, are very helpful for this population. And in fact, they can move to a less restrictive situation once they do have a good set of patterns and behaviors that are carrying them through. And having a way to access support for difficult behavior problems in the long run becomes very important. So when we think about folks who have a big gap between say and do, our interventions should really emphasize skill building and positive routines. And the skill building aspects of interventions like DBT or DBT-informed skills, such as the skill system, are really important in helping our clients to develop those routines, those coping routines that help them work through difficult situations. For depression, behavioral activation, especially if there's help from the environment to use it, can be especially important for our clients. Incentives and short-term goals and rewards become very important. As I said, maybe providing incentive to get all the way through an assessment period and to create goals. And there's research that actually Dr. Corrigan and his partner Ginny Bogner did show us that increases engagement in treatment, and that benefit lasts well into the course of treatment. And then using approaches like the community reinforcement approach, and that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but helping a client to develop alternative activities that directly compete with the tendency to use substances or have other harmful behaviors, and developing formal and informal supports in the community to support those behaviors. Now, we're not going to get, because I see I have about 7 minutes till 4, so I'm going to start to wrap up here. But when we think about developing programs of care, it's really important to think about how aware a person is of their neurocognitive impairment. And we can talk about awareness as being based on reasoning, attention, and memory, and being a neurological process. And we can also talk about insight being a psychological process, where it's more based on a person's level of optimism, their self-concept, and how well they cope. And both of those things together will tend to dictate how well a person engages in therapy. And so when a person is relatively less aware, or they have no awareness, they are going to be less willing and able to actively participate in some of the interventions. And that occurs on a continuum from no awareness to intellectual awareness, where they know other people think they have the problem, to emergent awareness, where they realize they got a problem right after the problem happens, to anticipatory awareness, where they're aware of their weaknesses generally, and then they work to prevent problems. So it really isn't until a person's got that anticipatory awareness before they can participate in a collaborative way to do those things that are going to help them to move forward. And so, and again, we'll dig into this a little bit more in the third webinar with examples. When you're thinking about interventions, if a person has little awareness of their problems, you're going to be looking more to environmental supports like supervision, structured activity, trustee, the legal system, reducing exposure to a substance of abuse. And when they have a greater awareness and more insight, you're going to be looking at collaborative interventions that are more client-centered, collaborative goal setting, motivational interviewing, supported trials to help them test out skills, and cognitive behavioral interventions that are more cognitive in nature. So when we're individualizing cognitive compensation, we're going to be observing the difficulty. We're going to be considering which problems may be occurring and how aware the person is of those problems. And then you're going to figure out a compensation. And if the client is fairly well aware, you're going to be working on that with them. And if they're not, you may be just developing the environmental support. So for example, if someone's missing sessions, here's Andy, and they're missing sessions and they're often late, and you talk to Andy about it and ask what's happening, and you get his opinion about what might be helpful, then you find out that he's just not remembering his appointments, and he also, when he does remember, doesn't leave on time, and then you can consider what might be helpful, reminders, an appointment card, and helping the client create the plan, and then evaluating if the plan is working and modifying accordingly. And the same thing can happen if a person's having neurobehavioral issues in group. And these can be more these are trickier to deal with sometimes. A person who's very talkative in group, and I think this was the example that Dr. Corrigan gave, might be, because they're disinhibited, might be viewed as egocentric or not caring about other people. And they may simply not be aware that that's occurring. And if you give them feedback that that's occurring, they may be able to work with you to develop a coping strategy that might include signals from the environment when they're talking too much, or structured requests for comments that help them to limit their comments. So program modifications generally, low barriers for the intake process, smaller groups, flexible schedules, the availability of case management services, and not assuming that skills that are developed in one setting will be workable in another. So in summary, there's a lot of things that you can do to accommodate clients with neurocognitive impairment. Increasing the emphasis on behavioral strategies, including the use of treatment incentives, can be useful after brain injury. And environmental support, such as case management, reminders, assistance in developing structured routines, support with financial management, all of those things are going to help with poor regulation. So before we end, I want to point you to an amazing website that has a lot of really great resources on it. This is the Ohio Valley website. On the left side of the screen there, you see Accommodating Symptoms of TBI. There's a fabulous brochure there that you can kind of download and look at, and I'll show you a couple screenshots so you get an idea of what's in there. And then the 4 modules that you can watch online, they're free, but you need to pay if you want to have a certificate, and it's a nominal fee. And you can learn the TBI identification method, which is how to screen for acquired brain injury. And you can also get some more information about the neurobehavioral impairments I've been talking about, the impact on people's lives, and how to accommodate the symptoms of TBI. Here's a screenshot from that brochure. This is an example. So it's very straightforward. They talk about impulsivity and what it may look like, and then some interventions that you can do. So somebody who may do or say things without thinking, you may want to teach them a strategy like stop, think, act, using rewards for immediate gratification and giving feedback. So things to remember: every client has a different combination of things going on, and a problem that you observe may have several different causes, but it's also true that several compensation strategies may be good for several different strategies, or for several different kinds of problems. And the recommended practices, again, screen for brain injury, try and have cross-trained staff members in brain injury, programs of care that aren't time limited, a low threshold to service entry, flexible schedules, case management supports, and options for small group and individual therapy. And I'm also going to put out there that it's a really important thing to find partners who are aware of brain injury in your area. And likely there is a brain injury association in your state. They exist in all 50, I believe, but you can maybe find a local agency too. And the way to the Brain Injury Association of America has a website where you can start to do that research and find out who might be available in your area so that you can have a brain injury partner who can help you as you're trying to accommodate your clients. And I'm just going to put in, at 4 o'clock straight up, I'm just going to put in a plug for the next webinar that happens April 8th, and it's at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we'll be looking at evidence-based practices and modifications for interventions, including motivational interviewing. And we'll talk a little bit more about case management model for complex problems. So I'm sorry, I went right up to the wire to 4 o'clock. I'm happy to stay on. I don't know if that's a possibility.
Yeah, you should have a few more minutes before Webinar Jam will log us out.
Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions that came up.
I'm not seeing any right now, but for those of you who are still tuned in, if you have some questions for Carolyn, this is your opportunity. We should have about 5 to 10 minutes left at the end here before Webinar Jam will close this session out. So please take a moment and type in your questions for her in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. Carolyn, thank you so much.
I'm not sure if I can see the any chat that's there.
Yeah, I'm monitoring. I don't see anybody typing anything in quite yet.
Okay.
We have a thank you from Layman. And Lisa says she has to get back to work, but thanks for such an informative presentation. Julie Sebastian is asking, any specific recommendations for individuals with brain injury and co-occurring personality disorders? I find it difficult to manage the self-evaluation piece with them.
That really can be a tough and something that a lot of folks struggle with. And I think when we're the most useful strategies that I find are working with the skills in DBT to be helpful. And so sometimes slowing it down and helping a person to recognize whether the first level of insight, or the first target for that intervention would be, am I ready to have a conversation or not ready? Am I in a good state of mind? And helping a person to recognize those criteria that are associated with being ready to listen. Is it a two-way street? Can I listen and speak? And then once a person is recognizing ready, not ready, and what their level of emotional arousal is, at that point sometimes then you can work on providing feedback. But I'm often tempted to sort of jump the gun and give feedback before a person's actually able to attend to that information because they're too emotionally aroused. I'm not sure if that's a helpful thought.
Thank you. Okay, and I know I just responded back to Angela via chat, but for those of you who didn't see it, I will be sending out a copy of the presentation following this webinar. Okay, well, I think we are at a good place to wrap it up. I'm not seeing more questions coming in. So Carolyn, thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to your next webinar, and I will be in touch with you sometime this next week. Okay,
great. Thanks so much for the invitation. It was fun.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.